Uh, I will be talking about, I was asked to talk about Islamic archaeology and architecture in Maharashtra. And it's really not architecture so much, but the history of architecture that I'll be talking of. And this is a distinction I'd like to make right at the beginning, which is that architecture is a practice discipline. It's like painting, it's like art, where you indulge in the creation of things. What we are interested in as historians is the history of architecture, broadly grouped together with the history of art. So architecture is the object of study, and there are two ways you can approach it, one of which is through archaeology, and we've seen excellent examples of that, and the other really is to look at it stylistically. And both these methods are used in the absence of any kind of written record. History deals with the written word. It deals with epigraphy, it deals with textual records, it deals with chronicles, with texts. Archaeology, a lot of times, relies on a purely material record, and so does the history of art or the history of architecture. So these are both disciplines that rely on studying materials and trying to understand meaning behind various kinds of material. Now, of course, there is a problem we have in India and in Maharashtra is things for which we have a rich historical record, we do not like to think of them as worthy of archaeological exploration. And so particularly from the 12th, 13th century onwards, when you have a proliferation of Persian and Arabic records, and from the 16th, 17th century onwards of courtly record keeping all across India, nobody thinks that archaeology or the history of architecture should be a way of actually studying these periods and civilizations. Contrast that with something like the United States, where things from even 30 or 40 years ago are subject to archaeological exploration. So in many places, you do have this situation where if you need to construct anything, an archaeological review of your site is required before you can construct a road or a building or a dam. A lot of times you'll find things that are absolutely what we might think of as commonplace and routine, things like nails and Coca-Cola cans from the 1950s. You might find things that you think of as trash, but they are part of the archaeological record, and just because they're closer to you in time doesn't make them any less important. Now, one of the first problems we've had in India, and this is something that was commented on in early Indian history congresses by people like Niharanjan Ray and so on, was the problem of periodization in India, where in Europe, a set of social and economic changes through 2 millennia have defined for them what various periods are called. And so they do have a medieval period, the Dark Ages, because it's something in between late antiquity, which is kind of the decline of the Roman Empire, the decline of their classical world, and the Renaissance, which is a rebirth of that classical world. In between, you have 400 or 500 years of the Dark Ages, the medieval period as they call it. We do not have the same kinds of events taking place in South Asia, yet we choose to hang on to that kind of terminology. And therefore, the periodization we have for history is not uniform across the board, where somebody who talks of medieval in South India might refer to a very different period from somebody who's working in Bengal, for example. We also do not have a kind of fine-grained understanding of many of these late historical periods. And these periods also need to be subject to archaeological research of some kind. And so, the classic way of looking at things was define a classical period when you have the rise of classical Sanskrit, typically with the Guptas and so on. Then after the Guptas, you have this big medieval period, which stretches all the way till the British show up. And then you have a colonial period. And, again, through all kinds of enterprises of connected histories, people, particularly like Sanjay Subramaniam and so on, have argued for an age of sail, an early age of globalization, early modernity, starting around 1550, 1600. And so these are, fine-grained periods that we really need to adopt. And so, again, this is not any kind of solution, but really an example of how we can have a much better periodization. And then, of course, subject sites, subject historical sites within the past 4, 5, 600 years to archaeological scrutiny. And so the whole topic of Islamic archaeology becomes relevant once you start having this kind of fine-grained structure to, with which to engage with an archaeological record. Now, the archaeology of Islam, which has been an emerging field since the 1970s, since Oleg Grabar wrote about it first with Ettinghausen and so on, it's been theorized a lot, has a lot of problems as well. Islam is not uniform across the world in its practice. In its prescription, it might be, but like any religion, it gets practiced very differently in various places. And therefore, you can't have a simple model called Islamic archaeology where you identify everything that you find from an excavation merely by the assumption that it somehow is connected with Islam. There is a certain kind of uniformity, and people who talk of Islamic archaeology also acknowledge problems with it, but yet it is a field, and again, the only way to counter it is to have your own theorization, which will take it down in a book. This is particularly true in India, where we've had a long history of periodization by colonizers who sought to periodize India on the basis of what they thought of as dominant religious periods, which, as we saw in the case of Hindu or Jain patrons, was not true at all. I mean, religions flourish at the same time, they do coexist. And this all starts with, of course, the gentleman that you should all be aware of, Alexander Cunningham, who was obsessed with finding Buddhist relics and a kind of early historic Buddhist layer in Indian archaeology. He's, of course, known as the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India, but he starts off this whole business of periodizing India into periods which he will call Buddhist, Hindu, Islamic, and then to add to it the British, which is a very convenient argument that is carried on by the colonizing British for 200 years, because there is a certain kind of teleological logic to it by which they become the people who bring modernity. And so what Cunningham is doing is positioning himself in that last period, which is modern and colonial and enlightened. But before that, you have an Islamic period, which is seen as disruptive. Before that, there is a Hindu period, which might be called formative. But the real essence of India to Cunningham is the Buddhist period. And so if you look at his excavation reports, layers on top are cleared off to get to the Buddhist layer very quickly. In post-colonial India, we've adopted a slightly different strategy, which is we'll get rid of everything till about the 12th century and then start looking for finds. Everything, a period of 700 years, which is also very rich in material production, is usually considered a single layer, and unless there are finds worth recording, it's never studied for any kind of stratigraphy. And this kind of attitude has found itself in academic discourse for a long time. In the 1940s, a couple of very important books by Percy Brown called Indian Architecture were published. These still are the standard textbooks used by a number of architecture schools and also departments of history. And the books, of course, periodize everything into a Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain period, and then an Islamic period. And so in many ways, this mischief continues with a book published in 1993, a wonderful book by Christopher Tagel called The History of Architecture in India. And if you look at the subtitle, it says, From the Dawn of Civilization to the End of the Raj, which also means from the dawn of civilization till the end of civilization. They've seen themselves as the people who bring civilization, but they've also figured out your old civilization. Everything in between is not worthy of study. And so we see this time and again where historical archaeology particularly of the past 600-700 years, is ignored even in sites that are extremely rich, because it's much easier to rely on textual chronicles than actually carry out excavations, as a result of which we do not have good stratigraphic sequences for the past 600-700 years. So people will say, oh, this is from the Islamic period, which means it can be from 1300 to 1800 anytime. But there are ways by which you can tell pottery that's from the Sultanate period, from the Delhi Sultanate, from the early Sultanate, from the Mughals. For example, you find this blue and white pottery everywhere in the 16th and 17th century that is brought in from China. Mass-produced goods flooding the market is nothing new for them. But archaeology is not a means of exploring the past millennium for the most part. And therefore, when archaeological sites are chosen, people love sites where later deposits are fewer. You start looking for sites where you can start from the 13th or 12th century and then go before. And so, case in point, this is very small on the screen. You might not be able to read it. But again, if you look at the periods that they define and describe, there is a big chunk in between, which is absolutely missing. This is the report of Python published recently, Derek Kennett and others. And so what you have in many parts of the world, this is in Iran, is very good pottery sequences, a very good understanding of the evolution of various kinds of ceramics in this last millennium, which we seem to lack. And then, of course, there is also this. I think I might be short on time, so I don't want to take up. But this is a reply by the ASI to me many years ago when I asked them, how do you decide what's a site of national importance? And they said, we don't. There are no objective criteria. We just carry on with Curzon's list with a few changes. Now, having said all this about a certain kind of non-uniformity in Islamic architecture or Islamic lands, there is a certain thread that pulls through. And that's what we look at when we look at the architecture of Islam, particularly in Maharashtra towards the end. Now, let me really say that it finds local expression in every time and place and period, which is very different. So you have Islamic architecture, certainly a mosque you cannot call by any other name. It is in the service of religion, and therefore it is by definition Islamic. But there is also a great amount of variety in the styles that get deployed for such an architectural program. Now, one thing we have to make a distinction about is architectural program versus architectural style. And we'll talk about this in just a minute. And so this is the same architectural program, which is what a building is purpose-built for. It's built as a mosque, but the style is very different. This is called the Spanish mosque, and there's a long story to this, which we won't indulge in right now. And this, which would look to you like an Islamic building, is actually a temple from the 18th century. And you will see a lot of buildings like this all across Maharashtra, which on the face of it, we will call Islamic because we see domes and minarets and certain kinds of stylistic features that we've always associated with Islam. But yet, this is the local architectural style in the 17th, 18th centuries. And then, of course, like these mosques in Kerala, vernacular architecture plays a very big role in shaping what buildings look like. You can't tell in this period in Kerala whether a building is a mosque, a synagogue, a temple, or a church. They all look like this because this is vernacular architecture responding to climate and local realities. So architectural form of religious architecture is informed by three things usually. One is practices, liturgical practices, or any kind of practice. So in a mosque, the requirement is for a lot of people to come together and pray in the same direction, and that will shape what the architecture is like. Here's a photo of a church in Goa, where again, the liturgy will dictate the kind of form you have. Then you have cosmology, an idea of how the world is shaped and how it came into being. And this forms a very important part of religious architecture because you want to create buildings that are homologies of the cosmos. And then, of course, you have beliefs. Some are rooted in history, some are rooted in folklore, which are going to shape how your religious buildings look like. So, for example, there is a description of the Prophet Muhammad's house and how the first mosque really derives from it. And this is partially rooted in history or folklore. Now, style, which is how we look at architecture, we look at elements and say, oh, this is Gothic, this is Islamic, this is Mughal, this is whatever it is really looking at shapes. And shapes of buildings are derived from materials, technologies, and the resultant forms. And so for, in Maharashtra, certain kinds of materials, technologies, and resultant forms come with Islam for the first time. For example, the widespread use of lime mortar in creating lime concrete to build buildings. Also, arcuated forms, building through arches, comes for the first time. And certain kinds of architectural programs also appear with Islam for the first time. So if you have something that looks like a hammam, you can be sure that it's not before the 12th century or before the 13th century for that matter. So architectural programs can be deemed Islamic, and so can architectural styles. And an architectural style, like I said, really derives from material, the technology you can have with that material, and there is a form that is really a result of that. So for example, in Iran, for 2,500 years, they've been using mud brick everywhere, sun-dried mud bricks. And what can you do with these mud bricks is basically build arches of all kinds. You can build squinches, you can build slabs, and this is how their architecture will shape eventually to have a vaulted system, because you're not using big pieces of wood or stone, you're using small bricks, and the only way you span over spaces is to create these kinds of arcuated forms. And so again, I mean, you look for 2,500 years, this is Sasanian, this is slightly later, but there is a rich history of building these forms as a result of the material and technology for over 2 millennia. And this form eventually will acquire meaning because you're surrounded by it. And humans have to attach meaning to all kinds of forms. And this is a form that will survive. So even if the material changes and the technology changes, the form persists. This is the endurance of style. In fact, it will travel to India, the madrasa of Mahmud Gawan in Bidar. You'll see it at Fatehpur Sikri. You'll see it being used everywhere. This form doesn't have to be used with this material and technology, but as a stylistic element, it continues even into the Victoria Memorial. And so architectural style is one thing you study for Islamic architecture, and the other is the architectural program. And remember, these are two very distinct things. Styles can be picked up by people of any persuasion or religion, and which is why you can always have temples that look like mosques. I mean, look at late Maratha temples with minarets and domes. I won't talk much about this. There is a certain kind of Islamic cosmopolitanism where this 9-bay mosque, the plan type that you see here, appears in Toledo in Spain and Balkh in Afghanistan within a period of 2 years from each other. This is how quickly these plan types, these forms, these styles are moving around. And so you have to keep connected with that much larger world. And there is also a local indigenous tradition, which you still have to respect because there are local realities you can't get away from. You can say anything to a mason, say, build me this, but he's only going to build what he or she can. Well, it's mostly he in this period. And you see this in painting as well, where you have, again, Iranian prototypes, Indian sensibilities, all kinds of things happening. And this is the very fertile ground of Maharashtra in the period from 1300 to 1800, where you start seeing Maratha architecture borrow immensely from Islamic forms. I won't talk about this inscription or this, but remember, these are 3 monuments from the 17th century. The one on the top left is Shivaji's paternal grandfather. On the top right is Shivaji's maternal grandfather, Lakhuji Jadhav Rao. At the bottom is a temple at Raigad, right? And you look at all these, they have parallels with Adil Shahi and Nizam Shahi buildings, including in all their details. And again, we won't venture much into those details. We can talk about this. At a place close to Sindkhed Raja, at a place called Deolgaon Raja, is a set of mausolea like this. These are not dargahs, these are not Islamic buildings. These also belong to the Jadhav Rao family, and these are from the 18th century. This is the fashion. Is this Islamic? Yes. On a purely stylistic note, yes. But on a programmatic note, no. And so these are the buildings. Again, the placement of tombs around the Krishneshwar temple or samadhis is no different from how you place shrines around a dargah, burials around the dargah. And this is the temple we were looking at. And I have examples of a lot of what might be Islamic styles coming into Hindu architectural programs in Maharashtra. So the 9-bay plan, which is used, it's also the plan for a typical baradari, which you see at the bottom left. Baradari is a 12-opening pavilion because it's based on a 9-bay plan. And you find it at the Omkareshwar temple in Pune. You look at the Naroshankar temple in Nashik. The enclosure wall of this temple is exactly the same enclosure wall as any Mughal garden. You look at the temple at Tasgaon, near Sangli. And what you see is a plan type called the Hasht Bihisht, which you see over here, which is a central domed area surrounded by 8 spaces. What you see in a lot of monuments, including the Taj and Humayun's tomb, it's actually used for a temple here, and which is why the temple has odd spaces at the back that completely cannot be used to access the temple itself. And then let's not forget, when the Marathas occupy Daulatabad in the 18th century, they built a Ganesh temple halfway up the hill. And again, had we not noticed through stylistic detail certain things, we would never know what this is, and it might have been thought of as a dargah. So the style, the Islamic style of architecture becomes so rooted here that it really is used in combination for everything. At least elements of that are used. And in the absence of convenient texts for a lot of buildings, in the absence of inscriptions, which we don't have so commonly, stylistic analysis is completely inadequate because you can't even tell if it's Hindu or Muslim. What you really need is archaeology of this period. And so I'll end right there. Thank you.